You guys are all here to see me, right? It's been a long week, hasn't it? But we're almost there, and we've got two more amazing sessions on this show. We've got Designing the First Multi-Species City coming up now. It's our next panel, and it explores a provocative but practical idea: an animal commissioner as part of London's civic infrastructure, an advocacy body inside the system, shaping decisions about planning, development, and infrastructure before harm is designed in. Please welcome the Empathy Project founder, Bilchitz, Animal Law Reform South Africa's director, Professor David Bilchitz, and Play Foundation and executive director, Kalpana Arias, and their moderator, founder and director of Animal ThinkTank, Mark Westcombe.
Hey, thank you, everyone. We're going to be talking about London as a potential first as a multi-species city, which when we proposed this panel 6 months ago, I did think, is that a bit too wacky? Is that a bit too futuristic for 2050? And then we had David Attenborough's film over Christmas, Wild London. And then probably most of you won't know that Denmark this week, I'm feeling giddy a bit around this. They abolished their Department of Agriculture and replaced it with a Department of Animals and Nature. So, that's a really major shift. And Finland last week in Parliament debated whether to give equivalent rights to animals as humans. So it didn't pass, but to have a parliament who spent a year at the Constitutional Committee debating, exploring what were the implications, how could it be done, the idea that animals would have equivalence to humans in their constitution, I think is really, really major. So I'm starting to think this is not about 2050, this is about 2030. I'll turn to you guys. I'll turn to you, Cal, first, to kind of ground this in today's reality. So I was fortunate. I grew up on an animal farm. There were sheep, cows, pigs, chickens. So I have a kind of real strong sense of the daily lived reality of animals. I kind of wondered, somebody living in London and their exposure to animals, is going to be much more limited. So I was kind of curious, what is the daily lived reality of animals in London today?
Well, can you hear me okay? Hello? Yeah, okay, just checking, mic checks. It's a very good question, and I'm very limited to my human experience because I'm not an animal in the city, I'm a human species living in a city. And I think as the reality of our humanity right now is that we are so separated from nature, and that's not done by our personal choice, but actually through design, and that's through the design of the cities that we live in, but also the technology that we consume. And so I think for us to kind of reground ourselves into who we are as humans is an important step in readdressing our relationship to animals in a city. I'll take the example of sharing this quote from a zoologist who I'm now blanking his name, but he's a German zoologist that I think in the 1980s coined a word called the Umwelt. And the Umwelt is essentially this sensory bubble in which all species live within. And basically, this kind of points to the fact that while we're all different species sharing a planet, we all live in different worlds. And I think it's really important to ground it into the fact because now we're living in the era of the Anthropocene, where a lot of our built environment is impacting other worlds and other ecosystems. And I really want to bring this back into, and thread it back into this notion of design, especially in cities, which are creating, a grand impact into what our environments look like. And right now, we've got more, concrete and built environment that outweighs the natural world. So if we're thinking about stepping into the future and what those realities of animals in the more than human world is going to look like, I think we have to really rethink just design at its core. And Michael Murphy, who is an incredible architect, once said, "Great design is a human right." And I'll extend that to saying it's a right across all species. We all have a right to live and breathe in this wonderful, beautiful planet. And so rethinking the design of our cities so that it actually integrates species alike is really great. And I mean, I think the enemy of London would be probably foxes, and a lot of people have different love-hate relationships with foxes in London. But Mile End is a really incredible example of what it looks like when human infrastructure and man-made infrastructure connects to the natural world. And one of those things is a nature corridor and a nature bridge that was converted. It used to be a motorway, focused on people and cars, and now it's completely transported and available for animals to use and to live and to walk by, because I can't ground this more enough, but nature has no borders. So when we're thinking about the design and the built environment, we have to think through the lens of nature.
Thank you. Belle, jumping forward to 2030 or 2050, what would a multi-species city mean to you?
So sometimes when I mull over this, and guys, you've come to a panel where we really want to be talking about this for 3 hours, but for me it means relief. So I sometimes invite people to imagine what it would be like if we could all step out now, knowing that all species were living comfortably in safety, no one had been harmed for our food, our fashion, whatever it is, that we had finally created a culture in which all beings were considered, their well-being is considered. And I'm less interested in, Swift boxes and things like that, because I think we will come to those. I'm interested in the culture that takes us there, to that point where we do care about other species, and that's where I get really, really excited. So imagine that we were all concerned with the well-being of other species, and I've actually lived this moment. And I recall I was Extinction Rebellion, took over Trafalgar Square 2018, and there were wonderful things happening. Talks over there, vegan food over there, and I was part of a group of people grinding spices in the middle of Trafalgar Square. And we were grinding, and a bee came, a bumblebee flew amongst us. And almost without speaking, we all fell silent. And I remember the 3 emotions at that point were awe, because we couldn't believe that this incredible being was amongst us. Concern, because we were worried about the well-being of this creature in the middle of London, away from fields and meadows and wildflowers. And also this idea of relinquishment. We had to let this creature go. And I think that these are 3 mind states that we will need to adopt when we consider the well-being of other species. We must learn to adore them. I think we often say we do, but it's not coming out enough yet. We will feel concern about their well-being. We will want to change our environment for their well-being. And this idea of relinquishment. We can't own them, we can't hug them, this is a new relationship we need to model. So this is the cultural element of London 2050 I'm interested in. What takes us to that point where we are designing the Swift boxes and the highways and the green spaces beautiful though, beautiful shift.
What do you think that bee or any other animal might say to us or ask to us of, what would their story be about? Can you do this for us this is our vision for London 2050, multi-species?
I can't step into the consciousness of a bee yet. I think if I wanted to and this is also part of the cultural shift, is how we learn to listen and how we learn to observe. But I think one of the almost uniform things that most other species will ask of us now is to leave their habitats alone so that they can be amongst their own. I don't even think I'm being very daring in that assumption, because at the moment we are encroaching on natural spaces at a devastating rate, and I do need to give this statistic, only 4% of mammals alive today are wild. And that 4% sorry Mark, but they stand right on the front line of climate change. That 4% is going to drop to 3%, is going to drop to 2%, unless we act, unless we create London 2050 and London 2030, to be honest. This is a climate emergency, it's an ecological emergency.
I think sort of growing up on a farm, I had so I grew up in a rural environment. There were only 3 other kids in the village that were 7 miles away. So my early life was basically constructed of farm animals, and that's who I related to. So I did have a lot of sympathy, and I had a lot of sense as a small kid about what they wanted, and yeah, being left alone was where I ended up. It's just like they just want to be left alone. Turning to you, David. So I mean, South Africa's got very interesting, I think, constitutional conversation around animals and humans that you've been engaged with for a long time, and you've been an acting judge on the Constitutional Court in South Africa. And it was interesting to me coming into this space, discovering how much lawyers and legal people talk about the interests of animals. So what have you got to say what do the legal people say about what are the interests of animals? Why should animals matter?
So I think it's important to go back to like first principles, essentially. Like imagine I'm a frustrated person and I take this phone and now I'm really frustrated and I smash it down, right? And some of you are going to think that I'm a bit unhinged, but very few of you are going to think that I've done something wrong to the phone. We regard the phone as an instrument for our own purposes, for communication, for getting information, for various other things, and we call that what we call instrumental value. Now, if you imagine I was frustrated here and we had a little puppy over here, and I were to kick that puppy such that it yelped, I think many of you would hopefully come and stop me and intervene, but you would think that I'm not just unhinged, that I've done something particularly wrong in relation to that creature, right? And why is that, right? And you may think, well, it's quite obvious, because the dog can actually feel. There's something, as the philosopher Thomas Nagel says, there's something it is like to be the dog. There's something it is to inhabit the experience of the dog. And many of you can relate to that now, right? You may be feeling stimulated, bored, hungry, all those kind of things. There's something in each one of you that it is like to be you, right? And animals have that similar quality. There's something from the inside that it is like to be the animal. They can experience frustration, boredom, and also many, many positive states. And once you are sentient, we often put that as saying we're sentient beings, you have intrinsic value. Your value matters not just for the purposes of others, but in and of your own right. And we know it's been quite a struggle in the human community. I'm also a human rights lawyer, right? In the human community to recognize that other humans are not instruments simply for our own goals, right? And what we're saying in many ways is that animals too are not instruments for our own goals. They have interests of their own. And we often think about this in terms of what we might call fundamental interests, right? And many of you will feel that, like freedom, the ability to choose what you do, when you want to do it, to speak, to have enough food, etc. These are all interests that matter to you, and often they're actually protected by instruments like human rights. Animals also have some of those foundational interests. I've just come back from South Africa, as Mark was saying, from involvement in a case to free 3 elephants from the Johannesburg Zoo. And those elephants are in conditions which are completely unnatural to their lives. Elephants have an interest in being part of larger families, in being able to roam, in being able to have multiple divergent experiences every single day. In the zoo, they are a pale shadow of what they're able to experience in the wild. And so when we think of animal interests, the law has actually constructed them in a very narrow way. The law's often said, are those elephants being abused? Are we directly hitting those elephants, harming those elephants? And that's not happening in the Johannesburg Zoo. But at the same time, the conditions in relation to which those animals are being kept are not enabling those creatures to flourish. And so we have to think not just about, and there's a lot of cruelty, direct cruelty as well, but not just about that direct cruelty, but also about, are we enabling creatures to live the kinds of lives that they in fact wish to live? And I think when we talk about legal interests, we're hoping to expand the vision from that more limited notion of avoiding cruelty per se to a more expansive idea of enabling creatures to flourish.
Turning to you, Belle, it's not a question I'd like to answer, so I'm putting you on the spot. Oh. So we're talking about, so David is talking about putting how we might treat animals or what their interests. So half of the talks at South by Southwest seem to be about artificial intelligence. And we talk a lot about how might we treat artificial intelligence if it becomes conscious.
Yeah.
The question that I'm more interested in is if artificial intelligence does become a smarter, more superior being to us, how would we hope artificial intelligence treats us?
Okay, so I'm very aware that there is a lot of talks about AI in the conference here. Coming from the background and my experience, I have a lot of concerns. We know that AI is biased towards the values of its makers, and at the moment, its makers seem very, very focused on operating within exploitative colonial systems. So if AI is the mirror to that, we are potentially in a position of danger. And I think if we want to talk about dynamics of power, we need simply to look at the fact that we consider ourselves more superior to animals. And I'm going to talk about animal farming in a very apolitical way. What we do to animals within the animal farming system is, to quote Yuval Noah Harari, perhaps the biggest moral crime ever. We are taking incredibly intelligent, sentient, compassionate beings, and we're corralling them into small, dark, hidden spaces. The entire animal agriculture industry is predicated on the forced impregnation of the female and the removal of her young. You wouldn't get billions of farmed animals unless we repeatedly impregnated young females. So farmed animals unless you repeatedly impregnated. It morally corrupt. It's absolutely morally corrupt. And that is what has happened because we consider ourselves superior cognitively, intellectually, to other species who we deem tasty. So if this position is then so that AI holds the power and they treat us like we've treated other animals, we have a potential issue on our hands. And I would like to flag up, who is AI being? I hear very little about grassroots or community or indigenous-owned AI systems. Systems, community groups that might be able to hold traditions of respect. I'm hearing more about big corporations for whom profit is key. So, yeah, I'm very concerned by that question. I'm very interested. I know that there are organizations attempting to create moral guardrails, and they need to be uplifted and supported. But we are in, a tenuous position, I think. I've got a lot more to say, but I won't say it.
Yeah, so Cal, I guess there's one human interest in shifting our relationships with animals about how we might indicate to artificial intelligence in the future of 50 or 100 years how artificial intelligence might learn to treat us. But I know in your work you also explore the other benefits to humans through shifting our relationships with other species. Do you want to just talk a little bit more maybe to the concrete of the here and now?
Yeah.
Why treat animals differently?
I mean, it's definitely like AI, especially I think at South by, is a very hot and heavy topic. My friend Lex, who's a technologist and creative coder, he often talks about AI from the lens of it's actually artificial stupidity, because it's very much still very early days in terms of how it's being built, how we shape it. And I think why these conversations today are so important are because right now tech is in the hands of the few and not the many. And so when we're rethinking about design, and again, bringing it back to design, because design has the power to change behaviors at a faster rate and at the urgency that we need to really face this poly crisis head on. And technology does have a role to play, but not in the way that I think we're being spoon-fed by either corporations or governments. And I say governments because they're at the hands of lobbyists and not in the pursuit or interest of the people. And it's the people in the room, the people that it's in your communities, your neighbors, your friends. If you think about not just that, but to the topic of today's conversation, thinking about multi-species and more than human worlds, think about the species that are in your life just on a day-to-day basis. Even if you're living in the city, you can think about the microbial world to very extensive, the animal kingdom. And in every single way of our lives, the world around you shapes who you are. And you've got a very specific power and agency to be able to advocate for those futures, for a livable planet, for a flourishing, biodiverse, and thriving city. And that will only come if we actually design with nature and not against it. And there's some really particular projects that are actually leading the way in how we include the more than human world and multi-species in the way that we design our tech. And this particular one is called SETI, and right now they're working on decoding whale language to bring back the rights of nature into the conversation on how do we protect our seas. And similarly, programs like that are happening across the city. And in London, for example, from a policy and governance perspective, London now has its first beaver officer in place when it comes to local democracy. And so I think technology has a way to open up our eyes to the world that's around us. Right now, we're very much in our human conditioning and in our programming of not really noticing the way that the natural world does impact us. But I think tech can actually help open up our eyes, our imagination, and our hearts in a way that we haven't really gone into. So that's what I'm really excited about.
In the past, you've also talked to me about sort of the threats of biotech, something which was totally novel to me, and that, like, sort of the need to protect rights of nature, rights of animals, around issues of biotech and how that can ultimately protect human society. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit to that angle?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal example, so there's a research organization in Harvard, and they run a course called How to Grow Almost Anything, and they are leading the frontier on biotechnology and what it means to actually design with nature. And specifically, I'm thinking about slime molds in this particular area, but they do things across the animal kingdom, from fungi to plants, and also to the ways that animals imagine. But some of the very first trainings that get put forward is that you have to think about the ethics when you're innovating or when you're building something. So I think, when it comes to all of these technologies, we have to put in guardrails in place because we know from past experiences and the technological world that we live now, if we don't put that in place, we will just abuse either the humans or the more than human world that it exists in.
Yeah. Back to you, David. So, like, when we're talking about regulating tech, regulating AI, that's governance or human governance. So governance is how we often will only ever thought of in a human governance terms. But we can also talk, and we are starting to talk about sentient governance, mostly around AI, but of course sentient governance would also relate to animals. So could you speak a little bit to what sentient governance might mean for us?
Yeah, I think when we think about our political community, we often think about humans participating in making decisions about how we are going to be governed, about conflicting interests, about various issues. And as you're saying, sentient governance is really about expanding the frame. It's about thinking about how do we integrate animals into our broader policy-making spaces, right? And the fact that, as we've heard, birds are affected by our planning policy. All kinds of animals are affected by the food practices that we have, attract animals in, but also create various harms that may or may not affect them, right? And so we need to actually have some kind of thinking around how they are integrated into regulation, into policy at various levels, right? There's the national level, there's a city level, which we're talking about today, and of course London has 32 boroughs, and so there's a kind of regional legislative assembly, of course the Greater London Assembly, and then we have the boroughs as well, and the boroughs tend to have animal welfare officers who deal with specific things, but one of the aspects that we want to kind of front, I think, is the need at a strategic level, which is at the Greater London Assembly level, to actually place animals on the agenda. And we can perhaps talk a little bit about the how as we go along further.
Yeah, well, I was interested because South Africa is one of the countries, and you've explored the relationship of sort of sentient governance in what it might mean for South Africa. So I was wondering, in those explorations, what lessons might you have for us in the UK as we might start to think about this?
Yeah, I've been looking at a research project of actually thinking about how do we integrate animals into our governance structures. And as you've said, South Africa actually has a specific statute that it creates a national society for the prevention of cruelty to animals. And in some senses, that is an advance. But in other ways, there are problems with the way in which that structure was set up. There was insufficient state buy-in, so the structure itself is not really funded by the state. It has to fundraise for itself, and that leads to all kinds of conflicts of interest potentially. It also, in many ways, the structure has placed differing functions within one body. So you have regulation and policy issues together with enforcement of animal welfare being lumped together. And those issues we actually may want to separate. We may want to think at a policy level of how animals are regulated, and we separate that out in the human community with our legislators, with our regulators, versus the actual enforcement, which is often our police, our prosecutors, etc., and they've been lumped together in many ways, and that creates very awkward sort of a one-stop shop in a way, which is not able to necessarily perform all those functions without adequate support. We also have a lot of centralization in one body, for instance. And there are actually multiple, I'm sure if we chatted to many of you, there are a lot of divergent voices as to what are, in fact, in the interests of animals, right? Actually representing animals' interests is quite difficult in some ways. And so we need to have some structures which, in a way, are open to the divergent voices that, in fact, exist. And so these are, I think, some of the lessons that the South African example has, and we can kind of maybe talk a little bit, as I say, about some concrete proposals for London a little bit later.
Yeah. I mean, we have the same conflict here in the UK, don't we? Because we have DEFRA, the Department for Farming and Rural Affairs, which is supposed to both be an advocate for animals and protect animals, but then at the same time is also trying to promote farming and animal agriculture. So, you know, I mean, that's just standard bad governance, isn't it? That you put in one unit somebody who's supposed to be protecting and advocating for someone, and then also sort of being the compromiser, the negotiator.
Exactly. Enshrining conflict of interest is something we need to avoid.
And I think we have, you know, the Sentience Committee, which is kind of like potentially the strongest form of representation of animals in the UK, is chaired by a farmer. It's like, you know, however much I love my dad, I wouldn't put my dad in charge of animal, you know, welfare in the UK. I want to come maybe to you, Cal. Like another topic that's kind of rising in popularity is the rights of nature, which is different to the rights of individual animals or multi-species or the individual. So I was just wondering, from your perspective, how does the conversation we're having here sit with the conversations that are happening around the rights of nature, which is much more sort of ecosystem orientated?
Yeah, I mean, I think as humans, we do this very, very human and tricky thing of just siloing topics out from each other, and that is kind of doubling down on that double-edged sword that is getting us into the same problems we are. So I see fighting for the rights of nature and fighting for the rights of animals and ecosystems as one and the same. And when you protect ecosystems, you protect the habitats. I mean, it's something that you mentioned, and you know, we just touched on with the issues on agriculture. Like farming in our agricultural land is one of the driving causes of biodiversity loss. It's the #1 driver of biodiversity loss. So if we're not protecting the environment, we're not protecting the context, everything else will start to fall by the wayside as well. So it's super important, you know, in the UK, we're now granting rights to rivers. Hopefully that's extended out to forests and ecosystems. But similarly, in cities specifically, and grounding this conversation of how do we actually design for a multi-species city, we have to protect the spaces that belong to communities, that belong to people, like your local gardens, your local green parks, all of that. Even if local governance is not giving essentially rights, you still have a right to place and a right to be there and a right to protect. And you know, this building is a very great example of that. So Truman Brewery is right now in default of becoming an AI data center space. And a lot of these buildings and bricks could actually be retrofitted to become habitats and spaces for birds, and by building in like brick swallows and things of that nature that support ecosystems, animals, and people. But instead, we're just giving things back to corporations and back to people who don't really care neither about nature, animals, or humanity.
Just one point that I want to come in and maybe disagree a little bit with Kalpana is the idea that the ecosystems element is the same as necessarily protecting individuals. And often we found, like in advocating for policy, that actually often an ecosystems approach is sometimes used against animal interests. One example, I was involved in a campaign to prevent culling of elephants, where they would go out and kill whole herds of elephants. And one of the main arguments was, well, elephants make changes in the broader environment as such, and they affect other species, and so their interests actually have to be sacrificed for the broader sort of eco-community, so-called. And in my view, I think we have to, no doubt, have some concern for the whole, but I think ultimately, my view is that the locus of value, that intrinsic value, rests in the individual, and it rests in individual humans and individual sentient creatures.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I also think, though, they can be great role models, and take the bumblebee, for example. I think without bees, people in cities don't understand why pockets of pollinators or pathways are so important in terms of connecting the city together. And so there's really great projects like Bug Life that are actually creating all of these bee maps of how all of these green spaces are so important. So it can play on one or the other, and it's not about siloing topics, but about allowing them to fight together for the same cause.
I was going to come to you, Belle.
Yes.
We could leave it to the politicians, we could leave it to the lawyers, we could leave it to the activists. Fundamentally for me, though, this would involve a cultural shift.
Yeah.
And there's the how to the legal, there's the how to the policy, but there's the how to the culture. Like how could you imagine that we might be able to shift the thinking amongst us?
So I'm so excited by that question, and actually David pipped me to the post. I think and again, it's a process of education. There's a knowledge lacking in most of our sort of interactions with animals, whether in ecosystems or species, and I think we need to start considering the animals as individuals. I think this is the big storytelling piece. Let me give you a very concrete example. Again, very apolitical, but I will talk about a pig. Undercover investigator went into a line of caged sows. I've told you this story. And one of the sows had worked out how to release herself from the cage. Now, you'd say, that's incredibly intelligent. She managed to get out. What the pig did next was even more remarkable. She released the other pigs from their crates. Now we're talking about an individual of extraordinary imagination, intelligence, and empathy. That immediately, I think, for most people, even those who liked bacon, would change their relationship with pigs. So these are the kind of, when you see the animal as an individual, not as a mass or a species or a group, but as individuals with stories, families, loves, likes, dislikes, quirky habits, fun little things that they do when they get excited, you start to really, this is the challenge, what does system change look like when you consider the animals as individuals and not as aggregates? And so that, for me, is the how. And I do a lot of work in this. I do a lot of storytelling about amazing, amazing things that individual animals do, because I think that is the, there's a nexus point. That's the transformational shift we need to see. That is the moment of true revolution away from dominant systems, when we start to see them truly as individuals alongside us. Because that's who they are. I'm not making up stuff. That's who they are, and that's being ignored at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, systems change is massive, and that's why we framed this as 2050, which is, and even then, a multi-species city in 25 years is ambitious. So I'm going to come to you, Cal, with sort of like more on-the-ground, practical experience. Like, what could we do? What could people in the audience just do today, tomorrow, this week to, I suppose, support or start that journey towards a multi-species city, start supporting the flourishing of other species in London?
Yeah, I mean, so London's a really incredible example. So if you haven't, if you don't know this already, London is the world's first national park city in the world. That means that there's a collective organizations, local municipalities that are working towards creating a greener, healthier London. And to give you a bit of kind of a numbers perspective, London is made up of 50% green space. I'll caveat by saying that only 20% of it is actually accessible towards the public. And with more boundaries coming up, as I mentioned, nature has no borders. How are we actually also creating exclusivity against animals and the movement of animals? But some of the kind of local democracy processes that we're working with on the ground through play and alongside of a coalition of different grassroots movements is local people's assemblies, where we're looking at how food, nature, and the right to grow is super important, especially within land access. And land access is a huge issue within animal rights in London. And what I would love to see and what I would love for people to imagine is actually hosting an assembly for animals to come into the processes as well. I'll bring in one of my favorite quotes from Ron Finley, who is a gorilla gardener in LA, and he often says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And animals today are quite literally on our menus. So how can we include animals within our local democracy processes? How can you think about the more than human world around you, extended across your human communities? And that's kind of my challenge to you guys today, is how you would imagine those processes.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of time. I was going to ask you all, like, what would you want the audience to leave with? I think I'm going to be leaving with that. If you're not on the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah.
But I'll pass the question to you, David, first.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just go to a little bit of concrete hows, because I did mention that I would say something about that, and I think that one of the important questions is to move from charity to governance, that we need to move from animal issues being all within charity sector, the non-profit sector, to actually being integrated into the government itself. And so some of the proposals we talked about in the blurb for this, an animal commissioner for the city. There has been commissioners for nightlife, for cycling. Why isn't there such a commissioner for animals that actually is able to sort of help advance the strategy around animals in the city, animals cross boundaries, and to create a broader kind of office that actually something similar exists in New York, an office of animal welfare, which has had huge impact on the city in New York. And so similarly for London, you could actually model that and even better it and create a kind of a structure that actually brings animals from, as I say, the charity sector. One interesting example that I was engaging with in preparing for this was the rehabilitation of animals that are harmed in the city. There are a lot of animals, foxes and mice and birds and various others who are harmed by cars, etc. And this is all essentially outsourced to a charity sector. And there is a role for the government to be able to coordinate, to be able to ensure that animals that are harmed, they may not take over all those roles, but that animals that are harmed are actually treated and actually provided proper medical care. So I think a key message from me would be to move animals, to ensure that animals are respected, that we understand the spaces of the city as shared spaces, that we actually recognize that animals need voice, and we provide for that voice in the very governance of our city itself.
I'm going to bring us to a close. I just want to share my journey. Like, I grew up on an animal farm. I was the eldest boy, and so it was expected of me that I would take over the farm. And so, I mean, as a young kid, I got taught to kill chickens, and then I got taught to gut pigs. I went to slaughterhouses. As a young person, I ran an offal club for my mates. And like, my journey has been that, you know, I threw in a successful career in management consultancy to dedicate my life to animal advocacy. I also see society going on a journey. Like, who was involved in politics, 200 years ago was just the landed gentry, and then it was property owners, and then it was middle-class men and working-class men, and then women, and then 21-year-olds, and then 18-year-olds, and now in Wales, 16-year-olds. And in Wales we have, I'm Welsh, I should say, like future generations are now included in the governance system of Wales. So every piece of legislation, every government budget has to be scrutinised for prejudice against future generations, and there's a Children's Commission again that scrutinises all legislation. Does this prejudice against children? So for me, the next part of the story, the conversation that we're starting is do we bring animals into our governance system? So what I'd like to leave you with is change happens not through the big people at the top deciding. Change happens through everyone in society having small conversations with their mates in the pub at the family dinner table. So what I hope we've done is planted you with a new conversation you can be having with your friends, family, and colleagues. And is it that the next step for human society is to bring animals into society, into our politics, into our governance? And can we be the first in the UK to have a London multi-species city? Can we have a UK multi-species nation? So thanks to my panelists. It was a fast journey through 40 minutes.
Call to action. I know.
We're already over.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry, guys. So yeah, just very, very quickly, we can't keep sidelining other species. You have to consider them as individuals. Please don't organize a conference without animals in it. South by Southwest has been pioneering and allowing us on stage. You will go to innumerable climate and nature festivals where animals are not mentioned. Inform yourself. The world's animals are undergoing, I can't even describe it. It's really urgent. But once you get to grips with what they're enduring, it will give new urgency to how you speak on their behalf. I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for
Thanks,
being here.
everyone.